He no longer believed he would survive another night when a strange raft with a small house appeared in the fog in front of his boat. What he found inside didn't just save him from death. It changed his life forever. Subscribe and write in the comments which country you're watching from. The smell of salt and diesel had once meant morning to him. It had meant that the day was beginning, that the harbor was waking, that the ropes would creak and the gulls would scream over the water as men pushed their boats away from the pier. Now it meant nothing. He sat on an overturned fish crate near the edge of the dock and watched the others go out, their silhouettes steady and confident as they cut through the pale fog. Nobody looked at him. Nobody needed to. He was no longer a part of that quiet procession that defined the rhythm of the village. He was only a man with nowhere to return to when the boats came back. His jacket was stitched together from two different coats, one darker than the other, the seam jagged and uneven along his shoulder. The sleeves were frayed where his hands had rubbed against nets and wet rope. His fingers were split and raw, the cracks white with dried salt. In the old days, he would have wrapped them in clean cloth before heading out, but cloth was something you saved now, folded carefully in the bottom of his torn bag. That bag held everything he owned: a rusted knife with a handle worn smooth by years of use, a photograph so faded that the faces were barely visible, only the suggestion of smiles, a wooden hook his father had carved for him when he was a boy, too small to be useful anymore, but impossible to throw away. When the wind came off the water, he pulled the jacket closer around himself, not for warmth, but out of habit, as though the gesture still meant protection. He had lost the house in pieces rather than all at once. First, the motor on his boat had failed, coughing and dying in the middle of the season when the shoals were thick and the prices high. Repairs had cost more than he had, so he had borrowed. Then the storms had come early that year, tearing nets, driving fish deeper, keeping him tied to the pier while his debts grew. There had been a sickness in the family, too, the kind that does not care how much money you do not have. Bills had followed, neat and official, each one heavier than the last. By the time the men with clean shoes arrived, carrying paper that smelled of ink and authority, he had already sold most of what mattered. The table he had built himself from driftwood planks, the chair his father had sat on in the evenings, the radio that had filled the small house with voices from beyond the bay. They were gone before he understood that the house itself was next. The day he went back after the locks were changed, he stood in front of the door longer than he had expected. It was not that he hoped it would open for him. He only wanted to look. Someone had ripped the shelves from the wall, leaving pale rectangles where the wood had been shielded from smoke and years of cooking. On the floor were the round marks left by the legs of the table, darker than the surrounding boards, as if the house remembered even if it had been forced to forget. He tried the handle out of reflex and felt the cold refusal of the metal. The man behind him had been polite, almost apologetic, as he told him that he had 5 minutes to take what was left. He had chosen the photograph and the hook and nothing else, because everything else had already been taken in ways that did not leave anything you could hold. At first, he had slept on the dock, curled between coils of rope like a dog that knew where it was allowed to be. But the nights were loud with footsteps and laughter, and he woke every time someone passed, clutching his bag to his chest. After that, he moved on to his boat. It was old, scarred by years of waves and careless landings, but it floated, and it was still his. He stretched a tattered tarp over the bow and tied it down with lengths of rope that had once held nets. When it rained, the water found its way through the seams and dripped onto his face as he slept. When the wind blew, The tarp snapped and shuddered until he was certain it would tear free and leave him exposed to the night. He learned to choose his mooring carefully, to find places where the pier blocked the worst of the gusts. He learned to light a small fire on the shore in a dented tin, just enough to warm his hands and dry his clothes, careful never to let anyone think he was camping where he should not. The days passed in a narrow pattern, out before sunrise to fish where the others no longer bothered to go, close to shore where the water was shallow and the catches small, back to the market with a bucket that was never full enough. He counted coins more often than fish, his eyes dropping every time the seller's hand closed over the scales as if the metal itself were a rebuke. He could feel himself becoming invisible. People stepped around him as though he were another crate, another stain on the boards. He had never thought that losing an address could make a man fade, but it did. Without a door to close at night, he was not quite a person anymore. One night the cold cut through the layers of his jacket and tarp as though they were made of paper. The sea was restless, slapping against the hull with wet, rhythmic sounds that echoed inside his chest. He lay on the hard boards and watched his breath turn into faint clouds above his face. The thought came quietly, not as a shout, but as a suggestion. If the boat were to drift, if the current were to pull him just a little farther than usual, perhaps he would not fight it. Perhaps the water would decide for him what he could not bring himself to decide. He did not sit up in alarm when the rope creaked against the cleat. He only listened, his hands resting uselessly at his sides. Later, long after the thought had faded into something like shame, he went out again when most men were already home. The clouds were low and heavy, pressing the light down until the world felt smaller. He rode without direction, letting the familiar landmarks slip behind him. The water was rougher than he had expected, the wind sharp against his face. Once or twice he loosened his grip on the oars just to feel how easily they could fall from his hands. Each time his fingers tightened again without asking him. The storm came suddenly, as it often did in those waters. The first hard drops of rain were like thrown gravel, stinging his skin and blurring the horizon. He turned the boat back toward the faint line where he knew the shore must be, though he could not see it. Waves lifted the bow and dropped it again with a violence that made his teeth knock together. He was wet through in seconds, the jacket heavy and useless. Somewhere in the gray confusion ahead of him he thought he saw a shape, darker than the rest, something that did not move like water. He told himself it was nothing, that exhaustion was making him imagine things, but he kept rowing toward it anyway, because there was nothing else to do. The silhouette did not disappear. It grew clearer as he drew closer, resolving into lines that made no sense at first. It was not a rock, not a buoy. It was too wide, too solid. A wall rose from it at an angle that suggested a roof. He blinked rain from his eyes and leaned forward, heart hammering for reasons he could not name. In the middle of that, he was no longer thinking about ropes loosening or currents pulling him away. He was thinking only about that impossible shape in the fog, and about how he was moving toward it, whether he wanted to or not. The shape ahead of him refused to dissolve back into rain and imagination. Each time the bow of his boat rose on a wave, the dark mass seemed to lift with it, stubborn and heavy, as if the sea itself were holding on to something it had not yet decided to release. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, smearing water across his face, and leaned forward until his knees pressed against the damp boards. The wind tore at his patched jacket and flung cold needles of rain against his cheeks, but he no longer felt them. The thing in front of him was too strange to ignore. It had edges, lines that did not belong to the chaos of a storm. There was a slope where no wave should slope, a shadow that did not move like water. For a moment, he thought of turning away. The sea was full of traps, especially after storms. Driftwood could hide a broken mast, nets could coil like snakes under the surface, and there were stories of men who had come too close to floating wreckage and been pulled under by lines that had wrapped themselves around their ankles. He told himself that he had nothing to gain by approaching it. He was tired, soaked, shaken from the cold, and his arms were burning from fighting the oars. But another part of him, the part that had not loosened its grip on the oars earlier that night, would not let him turn. He had learned to trust his eyes more than his thoughts, and his eyes were telling him that whatever this was, it was not ordinary. He slowed his strokes and circled at a cautious distance, letting the boat drift sideways with the wind while he took in as much as he could. The object was broad, wider than his boat, and it rode the waves with a steadiness that made his own craft feel like a toy. Beneath the dark slick of rain-soaked wood, he could see lighter shapes, rounded forms that suggested barrels or blocks. They dipped in and out of view as the water heaved, and he understood then that the thing was not a single piece of debris, but something built, something meant to float. And above it all, rising like a stubborn defiance of the storm, was a small structure with walls and a roof. A house, or something close enough to one that the word forced itself into his mind. He drifted closer, the side of his boat nudging against a jutting corner with a dull thud that made him flinch. The surface was rough under his fingers, the wood swollen and splintered by salt. He reached out and found a rope looped around a makeshift post, its fibers stiff but intact. His heart was pounding now, not with fear, but with the peculiar intensity that comes when you realize you are standing at the edge of something that might change everything, even if you cannot yet imagine how. He tied the rope around his own cleat, hands clumsy with cold, and for a moment the two crafts tugged at each other like reluctant animals before settling into a shared rhythm. The rain softened into a steady whisper, as if the storm were growing tired. He climbed onto the platform, feeling it shift under his weight, and was surprised by how solid it was. The boards were uneven and mismatched, scavenged from a dozen different places, but they had been fitted together with care. He could feel it in the way the structure absorbed the force of the waves instead of shuddering against them. The small house loomed in front of him, its door swollen shut by moisture, the outline of its frame dark against the gray of the sky. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch, suddenly aware of how quiet it was inside his own head. There were no voices telling him to be careful, no arguments weighing the risks. There was only the simple, physical fact of the door and the life that might or might not be behind it. When he pushed, the door did not move. He braced his shoulder against it and tried again, feeling the wood resist, then give a little with a tired groan. A smell reached him that made his throat tighten in a way he did not expect. It was not the stench of rot or stagnant water. It was smoke, old and faint but unmistakable, mingled with the dry sweetness of wood that has been sheltered from the rain. He forced the door wider and stepped inside, ducking his head as if entering a low room in a forgotten house on shore. The interior was dim, lit only by the pale reflection of the storm outside, but it was enough to see that the place was not abandoned in the way debris usually was. A folded piece of cloth lay on a narrow bench, its edges aligned with a care that had nothing to do with chance. A tin cup hung from a nail, swaying slightly with the motion of the waves. There was a sense of pause in the air, as if the person who had lived here had only just stepped outside and might return at any moment. His breath came in short, uneven pulls as he stood there, waiting for some other shoe to drop, for the revelation of a body or a trap, or some sign that this was all a terrible mistake. Nothing happened. The silence held, heavy but not hostile, and he realized that he was alone. The relief that followed was as sharp as fear, leaving him weak at the knees. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the steady creak of the floating structure sink into him. When he opened them again, he began to look more carefully, to let curiosity replace the adrenaline that had carried him this far. Outside, the rain eased further, thinning into a mist that made the world feel blurred at the edges. He stepped back onto the platform and walked its perimeter, gripping the low railing that ringed the structure. The sea had plastered shells and bits of weed to the underside of the boards, but the upper surface was cleaner, as if someone had swept it not long ago. He noticed the way the support barrels were tied in pairs, their knots doubled and protected from chafing. He knelt and ran his fingers along a seam, feeling the packed fibers that had been pressed into the gaps between planks to keep water out. Whoever had built this had not been improvising. This was the work of a man who had planned to be here for a long time. Near one corner, he found a set of faded marks where another rope had once been secured. The wood was worn smooth in a shallow groove, telling a story of tension and movement, of a line that had been tied and untied many times. It suggested that the house had not always been at the mercy of currents, that it had been guided, perhaps towed, along a route known only to its owner. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the weather. If someone had lived here by choice, had they simply disappeared into the sea, leaving their floating home to wander until it met him in a storm? He returned to the door with more questions than answers and noticed, half hidden behind a small cupboard, the corner of a metal box wedged into a niche in the wall. He tugged at it until it came free, its lid sealed with a strip of rubber that had kept the worst of the moisture out. Inside was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, the fabric stiff and darkened with age. He did not open it then. The storm had not truly passed, and he could feel the platform begin to yaw as the wind shifted. He tucked the box back into its hiding place and went outside to tighten the ropes between the raft and his boat, working with the urgency of a man who knows that the sea will not wait while he satisfies his curiosity. When he finished, he stood for a moment between the two crafts, rain running down his face, and understood that he had already made a decision. He could have untied the rope and let the strange house drift away, carrying its mysteries with it, and no one would ever have known that he had been here. Instead, he tested the knots again, pulling hard until his hands ached, and then climbed back onto the platform, closing the door behind him as the light outside faded. He did not yet know why he was staying, only that the thought of leaving now, of turning his back on this impossible shelter, filled him with a fear far deeper than any the storm had managed to stir. The door closed behind him with a dull, swollen sound, not a sharp click, but the tired meeting of wood that had been soaked and dried too many times. The little room rocked gently beneath his feet, a movement that was slower and more deliberate than the jerking motion of his boat. It felt, impossibly, like standing on something that trusted the sea. He stood there for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust, his breath slow, his mind catch up to the reality that he was inside a floating house in the middle of a storm. The first thing he noticed was the quiet. The rain was still falling. He could hear it tapping against the roof and the walls, but it was softened, filtered through layers of wood and cloth and whatever else had been pressed into the seams. In his boat, Every drop had been a reminder of how thin the barrier was between him and the water. Here, the sound was different, less urgent, as though the house itself were absorbing the violence of the night. He moved deeper into the room, his boots leaving wet prints on the planks. The space was no larger than a shed, but it was organized with the kind of logic that only comes from having to live in a place rather than merely pass through it. Along one wall stood a line of plastic containers, their surfaces clouded with age, but their caps sealed tight. Thin channels, cut from lengths of old pipe and lashed together with wire, ran from a small opening near the roof down into the mouths of those containers. He traced the path with his eyes and understood at once what he was seeing. Rainwater collection. Simple, obvious, and something he had never managed to make work reliably on his own boat because he had never stayed in one place long enough to refine it. He knelt and unscrewed the cap of the nearest container, bracing himself for the smell of stagnation. Instead, there was only the faint, clean scent of water. He dipped a finger in and touched it to his tongue, then hesitated, then swallowed a small mouthful. It tasted of nothing, which in his world meant everything. He looked more closely and found that the water did not flow straight from the roof into the container. Between the two was a squat, improvised column made from a length of pipe packed with layers he recognized. Cloth at the top to catch debris. Beneath that, a stratum of coarse sand, then a layer of darker, finer grains that had to be charcoal, crushed and cleaned by someone who had taken the time to learn how. At the bottom, just before the water entered the container, another fold of fabric probably boiled and dried countless times. It was filtration, not magic, not fantasy, but it was more thoughtful and careful than anything he had ever built for himself. He moved on, drawn by a smell that was now unmistakable. Smoke, old but not forgotten. In the far corner stood a small stove fashioned from a metal drum, its sides punched with neat rows of holes. Stones were packed around its base, creating a barrier between the heat and the wooden floor. Above it, a narrow pipe angled through the wall, dark with soot, carrying the smoke outside. He opened the stove and found a bundle of twigs and splinters stacked with military precision, each piece cut to a length that would fit the cramped space. A jar sat beside it, its lid wrapped in tape, and when he twisted it open, he found the brittle, resinous cores of pine branches, perfect for catching a spark even when the world was drenched. He laughed once, a short, surprised sound that startled him in the small room because it was absurd to find such careful preparation in the middle of the sea. Along the opposite wall were hooks, dozens of them, each holding something useful. Nets folded and hung to dry. Coils of line sorted by thickness. A row of metal tools, their handles worn to the shape of a human grip. There was salt in a sack, kept dry by an inner lining of plastic, and jars of something dark that he recognized as fish preserved in oil. Not luxury, not abundance, but order. This was not the home of a man who had been waiting to die. He returned to the metal box he had discovered earlier and pulled it free again, setting it on the bench with a reverence he did not yet understand. The oilcloth wrapper came away with a soft, tearing sound, revealing a stack of papers yellowed at the edges. They were not the kind of plans you saw in books or offices. The lines were drawn in pencil, reinforced with ink where the hand had gone over them again and again. Diagrams of joints and braces, arrows marking the direction of prevailing winds, notes in cramped handwriting about how to reinforce a beam before the monsoon season, about where to place extra ballast when the water grew rough. There were dates, too, scattered across the margins, a chronology of labor and adaptation. Whoever had drawn these had been learning from the sea, one mistake at a time, and recording those lessons so they would not have to be learned again. He found himself scanning the pages for a name, some way to turn the invisible builder into a person he could imagine. There were initials here and there, pressed hard into the paper as if the hand that wrote them had needed to assert its existence. He whispered them aloud, awkwardly, feeling foolish but unable to stop. It was the first time he had spoken in hours. When he finally leaned back against the wall, the storm had dwindled to a low murmur. The house rocked, but it did so with a rhythm that was almost soothing, like breathing. He closed his eyes and let himself sink down onto the bench, the plans still in his hands. He thought of the tarp on his boat, snapping in the wind, of the way water had crept under his collar and along his spine, of the nights he had counted the seconds between waves to distract himself from the cold. Here the air was warmer, not because of fire, but because the walls held on to heat, held on to the simple fact of being enclosed. He slept without deciding to. His body took the opportunity before his mind could object, and when he woke it was not with the usual jolt of fear, but with a slow, disoriented sense of having been somewhere else. For a moment, he did not know where he was, and then the filtered light through the small window reminded him. He pushed himself upright, stiff and sore, and listened. The sea was still there, of course, but it was quieter, calmer, as if the night had passed and taken its worst with it. He opened the door and stepped out onto the platform. The fog had lifted, revealing a pale sky streaked with the first hints of dawn. His boat floated where he had tied it, obedient and small beside the larger structure. He could see now, in the honest light of morning, how much care had gone into the house. The boards had been chosen not for their beauty, but for their resilience. The fastenings doubled where stress would be greatest. He ran his hand along the railing and felt the smoothness where someone had sanded away a splinter that might have cut skin months or years ago. Inside, he brewed water from the container in the little stove, marveling at how easily it caught, how little smoke escaped into the room. He drank slowly, savoring the neutrality of the taste. It was the taste of survival, of something that could be depended on. The plans lay open on the bench, their corners lifting and settling with the motion of the house. He bent over them again, tracing the lines, reading the cramped notes until the hand behind them began to feel familiar, almost present. He wondered where that person was now, whether the sea had taken him or whether he had simply chosen another direction, leaving his floating home behind. When he finally stepped back outside, the sun had risen enough to turn the surface of the water into a broken mirror. He looked from his boat to the house and back again, the question forming without words. He had come here by accident, carried by a storm and a moment of weakness that had almost been the end of him. He did not know how long he could stay, or what would happen if the currents changed and dragged this strange refuge away from everything he knew, but he did know, with a certainty that surprised him, that he was not ready to let it go. Not yet. The question that had formed in him at dawn did not demand an answer right away. It hovered at the edge of his thoughts while he moved between the raft and his boat, carrying over the few things he owned, feeling faintly like a trespasser in a house that did not yet belong to him. He set his torn bag on the bench, tucked the photograph and the carved hook into a dry corner, then stood in the middle of the room and listened to the way the structure creaked beneath his weight. It did not feel like the brittle, anxious groan of his boat. It felt slower, as though the house were considering the sea before answering it. He did not tell himself that he was moving in. He told himself that he was only resting, only using the shelter for a day or two until he could think clearly again. Yet the gestures betrayed him. He wiped the bench clean of salt with the hem of his jacket. He coiled his spare line and hung it on an empty hook. He propped the door open to let the damp air escape, then closed it again when the wind shifted, adjusting the latch until it fit more snugly. Each small act was a claim, quiet and undeniable. The raft, for all its solidity, was not without flaws. When the sun rose higher, he found thin lines of light where the roof met the wall, and when he poured water through the filtration column, he saw a slow drip forming beneath the second container. He knelt and watched it fall, counting the seconds between drops, calculating how much he would lose if he ignored it. He did not. He fetched the plans, spread them out, and began to match the lines on paper to the reality under his hands. He wedged a strip of cloth into the leaking seam, pressing it in with the handle of his knife, then sealed it with a paste of resin he scraped from the underside of the platform. It was not elegant, but it was effective, and when he wiped his hands on his jacket, he felt something like pride. By midday, the sea had settled into a low, glassy swell. He untied his boat and rowed a short distance, keeping the raft in sight as he dropped his nets. It felt strange to fish with a house behind him instead of a pier, to know that when he pulled the lines in he would not have to choose between selling the catch and eating it. He worked methodically, the way he always had, but now there was a purpose behind each movement that went beyond survival. He was gathering not just for the day, but for a future that had been unimaginable the night before. When he returned, he followed the instructions in the margin of the plans to clean and dry part of the catch for storage. He split the fish, salted them carefully, then threaded them onto the hanging lines near the stove where the air was warmest. The room filled with the clean, sharp smell of preservation, a scent that belonged to kitchens and seasons, not to the precarious life of a man sleeping under a tarp. He worked until his shoulders ached, and when he finally sat down to eat a portion cooked over the little stove, he realized that he was not thinking about the end of the day. He was thinking about the next. The nights were still cold, but they were different now. He lay on the bench with the door closed, the filtered sounds of the sea around him, and the darkness felt contained, shaped by the walls. He woke when the raft shifted or when the wind rose, but he did not wake in panic. He woke as a man wakes in his own room, attentive but not afraid. Once, in the early hours before dawn, he found himself speaking softly into the space, as if the house were a person he did not want to disturb. He did not remember the words afterward, only the sense that he had not been entirely alone. Days passed in this pattern, each one layering habit over uncertainty. He repaired a loose board on the platform using a piece of driftwood he had hauled up from the water, trimming it with careful strokes of his knife until it fit. He reinforced a corner brace according to the plan, adding a second length of wire where the waves struck hardest. The work was slow and often frustrating, but it absorbed him in a way that nothing had since he lost his home. When his hands were busy, his mind did not wander back to the night when he had loosened his grip on the oars. The sea continued to offer him its small trials and mercies. One afternoon, while he was pulling in a net not far from the raft, he saw a shape thrashing weakly in the mesh. At first, he thought it was a large fish, but when he drew closer he recognized the desperate, uncoordinated movements of a dog. Its fur was plastered to its body, its eyes wild with the blind terror of an animal that had been in the water too long. He dropped the net and leaned over the side, speaking without thinking, his voice low and steady. The dog snapped at him when he tried to free it, his teeth grazing his skin, but he held on, ignoring the sting, and eventually the mesh gave way. He carried the trembling bundle back to the raft and wrapped it in the spare cloth he kept near the stove. The animal's body was rigid with cold, its breath a series of thin, rattling gasps. He fed it small pieces of fish when it was able to swallow and kept the stove burning longer than he could afford, afraid that if the fire went out, the life in his arms would go with it. When the dog finally lifted its head and licked his fingers, he laughed again, the same short, startled sound, and felt tears he had not invited slip down his face. From then on, the raft was not only a house. It was a place of rescue, whether he had planned it or not. He did not seek out more strays, but the sea had its own way of delivering them. A week after the dog, he found a seabird tangled in a length of line, its wing bent at an angle that made his stomach tighten. He cut it free and set its bones as best he could, fashioning a splint from 2 sticks and a strip of cloth. He made a small box in the corner of the room, lining it with the dry grasses he kept for insulation, and placed the bird there. It glared at him with a bright, furious eye, but it did not try to escape. As he tended to these small lives, he noticed something in himself that he had not felt in a long time. The thought of drifting away, of letting the current decide for him, receded until it was no longer a presence but a memory. He still grew tired, still felt the weight of his losses when the work was done and the night closed in, but the darkness was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of breathing, with the crackle of a stove he had built to last, with the knowledge that he would have to wake in the morning because someone, something, depended on him. He did not yet know how long this borrowed stability would endure. He only knew that the raft held him, that the routines he was building were fragile but real, and that each day he stayed was another day the sea had not taken him. The presence of the dog changed the space in ways he had not expected. It did not move much at first, preferring to curl into itself near the stove, its ribs rising and falling in a rhythm that was still too quick, but the room felt less like a workshop and more like a shelter. When he woke in the mornings now, he reached for the tin cup by instinct and then remembered to set a small bowl of water beside the animal. He tore off strips of dried fish and watched with careful relief as the dog chewed, slowly at first, then with more confidence, as though it were relearning how to trust its own hunger. The seabird recovered more stubbornly. Its eye followed him whenever he moved, a bright, defiant point in the shadowed corner, and he spoke to it sometimes as he changed the bandages, not because he expected an answer, but because the sound of his own voice kept the loneliness from creeping back in. He named neither creature, understanding without quite admitting it that names made things harder when they were lost. The raft became a map of these quiet rescues. He shifted his tools to make room for the bird's box. He moved the drying line so the dog would not brush against the hooks when it finally found the strength to stand. Each adjustment was small, but together they transformed the house into something that no longer felt borrowed. It felt occupied, not just by him, but by a fragile, improbable community that existed because he had happened to look twice at something drifting in a storm. He began to spend more time near the raft than in the market. When he did go ashore to sell his catch, people noticed the change even before he spoke. He no longer smelled of damp canvas and smoke alone, but of clean wood and preserved fish. His clothes were still patched, but his movements had lost their apologetic quality. He stood straighter, and when the sellers haggled over price, he did not accept the first insult with a nod. He had food waiting at home now, water that did not depend on the charity of strangers, and that knowledge lent weight to his silence. There were questions, of course. At first, they were careless, thrown over shoulders as he passed. "Where were you sleeping these days? How are you keeping dry?" He answered vaguely, unwilling to draw attention to something that still felt too fragile to survive scrutiny. But the harbor was a place where news spread as easily as fish scales on a wooden floor, and soon it was not just the regulars who were watching him. A younger fisherman followed him one afternoon as he pushed his boat away from the pier, curiosity plain in his face. He did not speak until they were out of sight of the dock, then asked without accusation where the man without a house had found such steady luck. The older man hesitated, the oars pausing in his hands. He could have lied. It would have been simple to say that the fish had returned or that he had found a new buyer. Instead, he found himself gesturing toward the low line of the raft in the distance, barely visible against the glare. The younger fisherman's eyes widened, not in disbelief but in something like recognition. He did not ask to be taken there. He only nodded once, as if accepting that some things belonged to those who needed them most. It was not long before the sea delivered another test of his resolve. He was checking his nets when he saw a piece of debris drifting close to the raft. A broken plank, at first glance, nothing worth turning toward. Then the plank moved, jerked in a way that wood does not, and he realized that something small was clinging to it. He rowed hard, the dog barking weakly from the platform as if sensing his urgency, and reached down to lift a soaked, shivering kitten from the water. Its claws dug into his sleeve, its mouth opening in a thin, voiceless cry, and for a moment he was back on the dock with his bag of belongings, the weight of helplessness pressing on his chest. He wrapped the kitten in his jacket and held it until the trembling slowed. By evening, the raft held 3 lives that would not have lasted another day without it. He fed them from the stores he had so carefully built, measuring out portions not because he was stingy, but because he understood that generosity had to be managed if it was to endure. He hung new lines to dry the additional fish he would need, made room where there was none, and wondered, not for the first time, about the person who had first imagined this place. The plans were spread open more often now, their margins smudged with salt and fingerprints, and he had begun to notice a pattern in the handwriting. Certain phrases were underlined, written larger, as if the author had been reminding himself of principles rather than instructions. Do not waste. Secure everything twice. The sea is not cruel, it is only honest. Those words followed him when he went ashore and began, cautiously, to ask questions. He did not approach officials or the men who dealt in permits and fees. He spoke instead to the old hands, the ones who remembered when the harbor had been little more than a curve in the shore and a collection of boats pulled up on sand. Had anyone built a floating house, he asked, careful to make it sound like idle curiosity. Had anyone spoken of living off the water alone? Most shook their heads, but a few frowned and stared out toward the open sea, as if searching for something they had not thought about in years. One man finally said a name, quietly, and the sound of it was like a door opening in a dark hallway. The name meant little to him, but the story that followed did not. The man had been a carpenter once, he learned, good with wood and stubborn with people. He had lost his family, the details blurred by time and gossip, and after that he had begun to talk about taking his craft to the only place where no one could take it from him. He had been seen towing something large out past the headland one morning, a shape that looked ridiculous to those watching from shore. No one had seen him return. The knowledge settled over him with the weight of responsibility. He was not simply squatting in a convenient shelter. He was living in the remains of someone else's final answer to the same question he had nearly asked himself on the stormy night when the raft had appeared. The thought did not frighten him. It steadied him. He took the plans from their box that evening and smoothed them carefully, as if the man who had drawn them were watching, and promised nothing aloud except that he would not waste what had been given. As the days went on, the raft became less of a secret. People noticed it from the pier, a square silhouette against the shimmer of the bay, and they began to talk. Some laughed, some shook their heads, some whispered about illegality and risk. He pretended not to hear, but the murmur reached him even through the walls of his floating house. Once he found someone taking photographs with a phone, the lens pointed toward the animals sprawled on the platform in the sun. He met the stranger's gaze without speaking, and the man looked away first. At night, after the stove had burned down and the room was filled with the soft sounds of breathing, he lay awake and wondered how long it would be before someone decided that what he had built, what he was becoming, was a problem that needed solving. The sea had carried him this far. He did not know yet what would happen when the shore began to notice. The first sign that the shore had begun to take an interest in his floating life did not come with raised voices or official seals. It came in the form of a man in a clean jacket who stood at the edge of the pier one morning and watched him tie up his boat. The man did not fish. He did not buy or sell. He held a clipboard under his arm and wore shoes that were too polished for a place where scales and brine stained everything they touched. When their eyes met, the man nodded, as if marking a point on an invisible list, and turned away without a word. 2 days later, a notice was taped to a post near the market stalls. It was printed on thin paper that curled in the damp air, the language clipped and impersonal. Unauthorized structure. Obstruction of navigable waters. Requirement to remove. He read it twice, then a third time, not because the words were hard to understand, but because he wanted to be sure they were meant for him. There was no name, only a reference number and a date. It felt like the day he had stood before his locked door, confronted by the fact of his erasure, except this time the thing being erased was the first stable shape his life had taken in months. He did not go to the raft that morning. He stood on the dock and watched the tide turn, the dog's bark faint in the distance, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He had known this would come. He had not known how quickly or how little it would take. By noon, he was walking up the cracked steps of the administrative building, the plans folded into his jacket pocket like a talisman he was afraid to touch. The building smelled of paper and floor cleaner, a scent that had nothing to do with the sea. He was directed from one desk to another, his words dissolving into a series of gestures that meant, wait here, come back later, speak to someone else. When he finally sat across from a woman who looked as tired as he felt, he spread the plans out between them, his hands trembling slightly despite his efforts to steady them. He told her about the filtration system, about the stove, about the way the raft had held through the storm when his boat had not. He did not speak of the night he had almost let go of the oars, but his voice carried the weight of it anyway. She listened with the expression of someone who has learned how to listen without absorbing, nodding at the appropriate moments, then pointing to the place on the notice where it said the structure was not registered, not insured, not permitted. She did not say that it would be destroyed. She said it would be removed. The difference, she seemed to think, was kindness. He left with a stack of forms that asked for proof he could not provide. Address, ownership, permanent mooring. He held the papers loosely as he walked back to the harbor, the words blurring in front of his eyes until they became nothing but shapes. On the water, the raft looked the same as it always had, solid and unassuming, the dog sprawled on the platform with its nose between its paws. He climbed aboard and sat on the bench without moving for a long time, the forms in his lap like an accusation. He did not know what to do with the anger that followed. It was not loud. It did not demand release. It sat in him like a weight, pressing on places that were already bruised by memory. He thought of the carpenter who had vanished, of the careful notes in the margins of the plans, of the nights when the stove's heat had been the only thing keeping the cold from creeping into his bones. He folded the papers and set them aside, aware that ignoring them would not make them disappear. The morning the boats came, the harbor was already awake. He saw them from a distance, their hulls painted in the neutral colors of authority, the men aboard moving with the practiced efficiency of people who do not doubt their right to be where they are. He untied his own boat and rowed hard toward the raft, a sense of urgency propelling him faster than fatigue ever had. The dog sensed his agitation and paced the platform, whining softly, while the bird rustled in its box and the kitten clung to his shoulder when he lifted it. The officials did not shout. They did not need to. They approached with ropes and tools, speaking to each other in the calm, professional tones of people who have reduced a complex situation to a series of tasks. One of them held out a hand in greeting that felt more like a barrier. He said the words he had been waiting to hear since the notice went up. For your safety. For the safety of navigation. Please cooperate. He stepped between the men in the house without quite realizing that he was doing it. His voice surprised him when he spoke, loud and steady in the open air. He told them about the water he drank, about the stove that did not set the raft on fire, about the animals that would not survive another night in the sea. He pointed to the plans, unfolding them with hands that no longer shook, and explained the logic behind every line, every reinforcement, every small decision that had turned a pile of scrap into something that could hold a life. Around them, the harbor slowed. Fishermen paused in the act of mending nets. Sellers leaned out from behind their stalls. Phones came out, raised not in mockery, but in attention. Someone recognized the initials on the plans and spoke a name that carried a murmur through the crowd. The story of the carpenter was no longer a rumor but a shared memory, and it shifted the balance in a way no argument about permits ever could. The men in the boats hesitated. One of them made a call, his back turned, his voice too low to hear. The woman from the office appeared on the pier, her face tight with something like concern. She did not rescind the order. She did something smaller and, in its way, more significant. She said they would review the case. She said the raft would not be towed that day. It was not a victory. It was a postponement. But it was enough to make the air around him feel lighter. He stood on the platform after they left, the crowd dispersing as slowly as it had gathered, and felt the delayed rush of exhaustion. He had not won the right to stay. He had won time, and time, he had learned, was the only thing that could be turned into something else. He sank onto the bench and pressed his face into his hands, the smell of smoke and salt clinging to his skin, and when he lifted his head again, his eyes were wet, not with rain, but with relief that had nowhere else to go. The days after the confrontation felt suspended, as if the harbor itself were holding its breath. No new notices appeared on the posts, no clean jackets returned to stand at the edge of the pier with clipboards tucked beneath their arms. Instead, there were faces he had known all his life appearing at the side of the raft with hesitant smiles and small offerings that they tried to disguise as practical transactions. A man brought a bundle of boards he claimed he no longer needed and left them on the platform as if he were returning borrowed tools. A woman, whose husband had once fished beside him, handed over a sack of charcoal, insisting she had too much and would only have to throw it away. He accepted these things the way he had learned to accept everything else in recent months, without ceremony, but with a gratitude that settled deep in his chest. With help came change, not the kind that erased the raft's poverty, but the kind that made it sturdier without making it something it was not. He replaced a warped beam with one of the gifted boards, trimming it to size with a care that felt almost like reverence. He reinforced the edge of the platform where the waves had begun to wear it thin, layering scrap wood and wire until the whole structure answered the water with a quiet resilience. The dog lay in the sun while he worked, its coat thicker now, its eyes following his movements as if they were a story it did not want to miss. The bird had begun to test its injured wing, stretching it in brief, awkward motions that filled him with a cautious hope, and the kitten had claimed a corner of the bench as its own, its small body a constant, improbable weight. He no longer went to shore with the sense that he was trespassing. When he brought his catch to the market now, there were nods and murmured greetings, hands that lingered on his arm in a way that was not quite charity and not quite friendship. He paid back in fish what he could not in coins, leaving a string of silver bodies on a neighbor's table without explanation. He helped mend a torn net, lifting the work with the same quiet competence he had once taken for granted. It was not forgiveness that the harbor was offering him. It was recognition. One afternoon, he sat alone in the raft and unfolded the plans again, tracing the initials in the corner of the page with the pad of his thumb. The story, he had learned, was incomplete, a collection of impressions rather than a record, but it was enough. The carpenter had lost more than he could carry on land, and had taken his craft to the only place where loss did not require permission. He had built a life that the sea itself had eventually claimed, leaving behind not a grave but a vessel for someone else's survival. The fisherman cut a small piece of wood from one of the offcuts and carved the initials into it, the strokes slow and deliberate. He fastened the plaque to the wall above the bench where he slept, not as a monument, but as an acknowledgment of continuity. He was not the first man to be saved by this raft, and he would not pretend to be the last. The system did not vanish. It lingered in the background, a presence as real as the tide, but it changed its posture. An inspector came one morning with a form that was shorter than the others had been, its questions more like an invitation than a demand. Temporary mooring, maintenance requirements, conditions that felt less like a verdict and more like a conversation. He signed with the same hand that had once trembled over a notice of eviction, and felt the difference in his grip. Life settled into a rhythm that was no longer borrowed. He woke with the light and stepped onto the platform to test the wind, to read the water the way he always had. But now the raft answered him in a language he was learning to speak fluently. He checked the filters, replenished the charcoal when it was spent, made small adjustments that were invisible to anyone but him. He fished not with desperation but with discipline, choosing his times and places, bringing back enough to feed himself and his improbable household, and still leave a little on the tables of those who had stood beside him when the ropes had been tightened. The rescues did not stop. The sea continued to shed its casualties, and he continued to gather them whether they had 4 legs, 2 wings, or none at all. Sometimes it was nothing more than a piece of flotsam he hauled aboard and repurposed into a patch or a brace, but each act was an affirmation of the principle that had drawn him here in the first place. Do not waste. Secure everything twice. The sea is not cruel, it is only honest. On quiet evenings, he sat on the edge of the platform and watched the harbor lights come on one by one, their reflections stretching across the water toward him like tentative bridges. He remembered the night when he had loosened his grip on the oars and felt the current tug at his boat, and he marveled at the distance between that man and the one he had become. He did not feel triumphant. He felt grounded, anchored not by chains or paperwork, but by a routine that demanded his attention and rewarded it with something like peace. When the rain fell now, it drummed on the roof and flowed into the waiting channels, filling the containers with a sound that had become as comforting as any lullaby. He closed the door and listened to it. The dog curled at his feet, the bird perched on the edge of its box, as if preparing for a flight that would come in its own time, the kitten purring against his knee. The raft rocked gently beneath them all, not a miracle, but a structure of wood and wire and care. And he understood, finally, that a home did not need a foundation in the ground. It needed only a place where you could endure the night and wake with the intention to live the day that followed. Subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. Watch the upcoming videos and share this story with everyone who still believes that one moment can change a life.